This story is a work of fiction, created for entertainment purposes only. All characters, events, and situations are entirely fictional. Any resemblance to real people or real events is purely coincidental.
The throne room was silent except for the measured echo of Severian Kael's footsteps on marble older than memory. He had built empires on that silence, on the weight of his presence, the expectation of his wrath, the certainty that his word reshaped the world. 45 years of existence had taught him that emotion was weakness, that attachment could be exploited, that a man who ruled nations could not afford the luxury of need. And so when the High Council demanded he clarify the rumors, when they pressed him before the assembled court about the woman who appeared at his side without title, without acknowledgement, without explanation, he made the only choice an emperor could make. He denied her, not with cruelty, not even with hesitation, simply with the cold, surgical precision of a man removing something unnecessary from a tactical map. Elara Myrne stood 20 paces to his left, hands folded, eyes lowered, wearing the same careful invisibility she'd perfected over 24 years of being someone's tolerated mistake. She had known this moment would come. Known it in the way people know winter follows autumn, inevitable, survivable, still capable of stealing breath. She didn't flinch when he spoke the words. Didn't weep when the courtiers exchanged knowing glances, when the whispers began their familiar poison, when her existence was once again reduced to convenient fiction. She had been denied before, by her father who gave her a name but never his house, by her mother who died rather than fight for her legitimacy, by every room she'd entered where her presence required explanation. This was simply confirmation. The most powerful man in the known world had chosen his throne over her reality. And some part of her, the part still capable of hope, died so quietly no one noticed. What Severian didn't see, as he returned to matters of state with the satisfied efficiency of crisis averted, was the man watching from the eastern gallery. Lord Althorin Vey, governor of the coastal provinces, political ally of uncertain loyalty, had witnessed the entire exchange with the stillness of someone reading a text he'd already memorized. He didn't smile, didn't move. But something shifted behind his eyes. Recognition, perhaps, or opportunity, or something more dangerous than either. Because while the great emperor had just solved a political inconvenience, he'd also created a space. And Althorin Vey had built his reputation on understanding what others discarded. If you've ever felt invisible in a room full of people, if you've ever wondered what happens when power chooses wrong, stay with this story. Subscribe so you don't miss what comes next, because what Severian just lost, he won't understand until it's too late. Leave a comment if you've ever been denied by someone who should have chosen you. This one's going to hurt before it heals. Severian Kael had learned to measure time in conquests rather than years. At 18, he'd claimed his first territory through strategic marriage and widowhood. At 25, he'd absorbed 3 rival kingdoms through treaties written in their surrender. At 32, he'd stood over the body of his own brother, traitor, conspirator, fool, and felt nothing but the mathematics of necessary action. Now, at 45, he ruled an empire that stretched from frozen northern wastes to sun-scorched southern coasts, and the weight of that dominion had long ago replaced whatever capacity for softness he might have possessed. His advisors feared him, his enemies studied him, his allies calculated their usefulness with every interaction. And he preferred it that way, because fear was predictable, loyalty was purchased, and love, that dangerous, destabilizing force, was a luxury he'd abandoned in youth. The palace itself reflected his philosophy. Vast halls of cold marble, walls thick enough to withstand siege, corridors designed to disorient potential assassins, chambers built for strategy rather than comfort. Every surface gleamed with the polish of obsessive maintenance. Every shadow held guards whose names he didn't know. Every meal was tasted by servants whose lives mattered less than his digestion. He moved through these spaces like a monument come to life, admired, essential, fundamentally alone. His late wife, dead 7 years from fever he'd barely noticed until the funeral arrangements required his signature, had once called the palace a mausoleum. He'd considered it accurate. The dead didn't complain, didn't scheme, didn't require emotional labor he had no capacity to provide. Elara had arrived 3 years ago under circumstances so mundane he almost hadn't registered them. A minor house-pledging fealty had offered their service. meaning they'd sent their inconvenient daughter to perform whatever menial tasks might earn imperial favor. She wasn't noble enough to marry advantageously, wasn't common enough to ignore completely, wasn't beautiful in the obvious way that might have made her dangerous. She simply appeared one morning in the household staff rotation, assigned to maintain his private study, and he'd acknowledged her existence the way one might notice particularly efficient furniture. She didn't speak unless addressed, didn't linger where she wasn't needed, didn't make the mistake so many made of trying to be noticed. What changed, and Severian would spend months trying to identify the exact moment, was accumulation rather than revelation. The way she understood, without instruction, that he preferred his correspondence organized by urgency rather than sender. The night she'd entered his study during a particularly brutal headache and simply left willow bark tea without comment or expectation of gratitude. The afternoon he'd found her reading one of his military histories, not with the performative interest of someone seeking favor, but with genuine absorption that made her forget to be invisible. Small things, meaningless things. Things that shouldn't have mattered to a man who'd built empires on the bones of sentiment. And yet, over months that became years, her presence shifted from utility to necessity in ways he refused to examine. She became the person who understood his silences, who anticipated his needs without requiring explanation, who existed in his peripheral vision like a promise he'd never made. He never touched her. That would have required acknowledgement. Never spoke to her beyond practical instruction. That would have implied relationship. But he kept her close, reassigned her permanently to his personal chambers, dismissed other attendants in favor of her quiet competence. And somewhere in that careful distance, something grew that he had no vocabulary to name, no framework to understand, and absolutely no intention of claiming publicly. Elara Myrne had been born a mistake her father tolerated, and her mother died regretting. Lord Myrne had taken a servant to his bed during a winter when his wife was visiting her coastal family, and 9 months later found himself with a daughter he couldn't quite disown, but would never quite claim. Her mother had died in childbirth, some said from loss of blood, others whispered it was loss of hope, and Elara had been raised in the strange liminal space between family and staff. She ate at the servants' table, but received tutoring reserved for nobility. She wore hand-me-downs from legitimate cousins, but was taught to read, write, and carry herself with dignity her birth didn't warrant. She was Myrne enough to be useful, but never enough to inherit. Her father had looked at her exactly 3 times in her childhood that she could remember. Once when she was 7 and had accidentally wandered into a banquet meant for legitimate family, her presence causing such awkward silence that he'd simply gestured for her removal without meeting her eyes. Once when she was 13 and a visiting lord had commented on her resemblance to the Myrne bloodline, forcing her father to acknowledge paternity with the enthusiasm one might confirm an old debt. And once when she was 19, the day he'd sent her to the imperial palace, handing her a letter of introduction that identified her as household service rather than kin. He'd told her to be useful, to bring no shame to his name, and to remember that her position was grace, not right. She'd learned early that survival meant managing expectations downward. If she excelled too obviously at her studies, legitimate children felt threatened. If she showed too much personality, she was accused of presumption. If she retreated too completely into invisibility, she was deemed ungrateful for the charity of her existence. So she'd calibrated herself to occupy the smallest possible space, competent enough to justify her keep, forgettable enough to avoid resentment, silent enough that people forgot she could hear their conversations about her inadequacy. By the time she arrived at the imperial palace, she'd perfected the art of being present without existing, necessary without mattering. The palace had been simultaneously better and worse than her father's house. Better because the scale of it meant she could disappear into function, become just another body maintaining the empire's elaborate machinery. Worse because the stakes were higher, the scrutiny more dangerous, the cost of visibility potentially fatal. She'd watched servants dismissed for minor infractions, seen ambition punished as conspiracy, learned that proximity to power meant exposure to its casual cruelty. So she'd done what she always did, made herself useful in ways that required no acknowledgement, anticipated needs before they were spoken, existed in the negative space between command and execution. When she'd been permanently assigned to Emperor Severian's personal chambers, she'd felt terror before anything else. This was the man who'd ordered executions over breakfast without changing expression, who'd dissolved marriages with a signature, who measured human life in strategic value. Being this close meant being seen, and being seen had never ended well for her. But then months passed, and something unexpected happened. He didn't see her, not really, but he relied on her. Trusted her presence the way one trusts gravity. And in that trust, she found something she'd never had before. Purpose that didn't require apology. She knew it was pathetic, building meaning from serving someone who barely acknowledged her existence. But it was more than she'd ever been offered, and she'd learned long ago that people like her didn't get to be greedy about happiness. The routines between them developed without negotiation, like a language neither had consciously learned but both spoke fluently. Severian would wake before dawn. He'd trained himself decades ago to need minimal sleep, treating rest as weakness, and she would already have his correspondence sorted, his morning tea prepared to exact temperature, the fire in his study rebuilt from embers. He never thanked her. She never expected it. But there was a rhythm to their mornings that felt closer to partnership than servitude, though neither would have dared name it that. She learned to read his moods in the tension of his shoulders, the particular silence that meant migraine rather than contemplation, the barely perceptible exhale that preceded difficult decisions. He began, without realizing it, to time his day around her presence. Would delay meetings if she hadn't yet brought his afternoon reports, would find reasons to remain in his study during hours she typically organized his library, would feel a specific irritation when other servants were sent in her place. It wasn't desire, or so he told himself. It was simply that she'd learned his preferences, understood his systems, didn't require the exhausting performance of patience he maintained with everyone else. She was efficient, reliable, utterly unremarkable in every way except the one that mattered. She made the burden of empire feel fractionally lighter, and he'd grown dependent on that relief without examining what it cost her to provide it. Elara, for her part, had stopped trying to protect herself from the impossible hope growing in the silence between them. She knew it was foolish, knew that men like Severian didn't fall in love with women like her, that proximity wasn't intimacy, that being necessary wasn't the same as being chosen. But there were moments, small, fragile moments she hoarded like stolen treasures, when his eyes would find hers across the room and hold for a heartbeat longer than function required. When his hand would brush hers passing a document and he wouldn't immediately withdraw. When he'd ask her opinion on some minor matter and actually wait for her answer, as if what she thought had value beyond confirmation of his own conclusions. She'd begun to imagine, in the dangerous privacy of her own thoughts, what it might be like if he ever acknowledged what existed between them. Not publicly. She wasn't delusional enough to imagine he'd claim her before the court, marry her, give her title or status. But perhaps privately. Perhaps in the quiet of his chambers he might say her name like it meant something, might touch her face the way his eyes sometimes did, might admit that she wasn't just convenient, but essential. She fantasized about being asked to stay, not as servant, but as companion. About conversations that went beyond practical exchange. About being someone's choice rather than someone's charity. But she was careful never to reach for more than he offered. Never lingered when dismissed. Never spoke beyond what was necessary. Never allowed her expression to betray the careful ecosystem of longing she'd cultivated in silence. Because she understood, perhaps better than he did, that whatever existed between them survived precisely because it remained unnamed, unexamined, unclaimed. The moment either of them tried to make it real, to drag it into light and language, it would be measured against the impossible distance between emperor and bastard daughter, between absolute power and absolute invisibility. And in that measurement, she would be found wanting. She always was. The rumors had been building for months before they reached critical mass, spreading through the palace like rot through timber. Servants whispered about the woman who occupied the emperor's private chambers with alarming permanence. Minor nobles questioned why a girl of dubious lineage had such unprecedented access. Political enemies began constructing narratives. Was she a spy? A manipulator? Evidence of the emperor's weakening judgment? The High Council, that collection of ancient advisors who'd served Severian's father and barely tolerated his son, saw opportunity in the ambiguity. They'd long resented his absolute control, his refusal to marry strategically after his wife's death, his tendency to make decisions without their counsel. Elara's undefined presence gave them leverage they'd been seeking for years. Lord Chancellor Vorenus, eldest of the council and most skilled at weaponizing propriety, brought the matter before formal session with the precision of an assassin choosing the perfect moment to strike. He framed it as concern for imperial dignity, protection of the emperor's reputation, necessary clarification to silence malicious speculation. But everyone in that chamber understood the true agenda. Force Severian to either claim the girl publicly, thus exposing emotional attachment they could exploit, or discard her completely, proving he could still be controlled through manipulation of his private life. It was a trap constructed from etiquette and wrapped in false concern, and Severian recognized it immediately for what it was. He'd faced more obvious threats with ease. Assassination attempts, military coups, territories declaring independence. These were problems with clear solutions, enemies you could identify and eliminate. But this was different. This was his own council using the architecture of civilization against him, deploying social expectation and political protocol like weapons. To claim Elara would be to admit she mattered, to give his enemies a target, to transform private reliance into public vulnerability. To marry her, even if he wanted to, which he absolutely didn't, he told himself, would be political suicide. A bastard with no house, no dowry, no strategic value. His allies would question his judgment. His enemies would sense weakness. The carefully constructed authority he'd built over decades would crack. The council session was scheduled for midday, full court attendance mandatory, specifically designed for maximum visibility. Severian prepared for it the way he prepared for battle, identifying variables, calculating outcomes, determining acceptable losses. He would deny her, cleanly, completely, without hesitation or room for interpretation. He would make clear that she was household staff, nothing more, that the rumors were fantasies of idle minds seeking scandal where none existed. It was the only logical choice, the only choice that preserved his position, maintained stability, protected the empire from the chaos that emotional indulgence inevitably created. He didn't consider what it would cost her because he'd trained himself not to consider costs that couldn't be measured in territory or gold. Elara knew something was wrong the moment she entered his chambers that morning and found him already dressed in full imperial regalia. The formal robes he wore only for state occasions, the crown he normally avoided as performative excess, the expression he reserved for pronouncing sentences. He didn't look at her when she brought his correspondence, didn't acknowledge her presence in the particular way that had become their private language. She'd learned to read his silences, and this one carried the weight of decision already made, door already closed. She wanted to ask what was happening, but that would have required believing she had the right to know, and she'd spent 24 years understanding that her rights extended exactly as far as others' tolerance allowed. The throne room had been built to intimidate, and it succeeded even on those who'd stood in it 1,000 times. Vaulted ceilings disappeared into shadow, columns thick as ancient trees lined walls that had witnessed 3 centuries of imperial decree, and at the far end, elevated on a dais of black marble, sat the throne itself, more monument than furniture, carved from a single piece of obsidian that legend claimed had fallen from the sky during the empire's founding. Severian occupied it the way mountains occupy landscape, inevitable and unmovable. Below him, arranged in careful hierarchy, stood the High Council, lesser nobles, military commanders, representatives from every significant house. And to his left, barely visible in the deliberate architecture of the room, stood Elara. Lord Chancellor Vorenus opened the session with poisonous courtesy, his voice carrying the practiced projection of a man who'd spent 60 years turning words into weapons. He spoke of duty, of imperial dignity, of the unfortunate necessity of addressing rumors that threatened to undermine the emperor's authority. He never mentioned Elara by name, didn't need to, everyone present knew exactly who he meant, but described her presence as irregularity requiring clarification, as ambiguity that creates opportunity for speculation, as matter of household management that has exceeded appropriate boundaries. Each phrase was designed to force Severian's hand, to make silence itself an admission of inappropriate attachment. The assembled court watched with the focused attention of predators sensing blood. Some had genuine concern about imperial propriety. Others saw political opportunity. Most simply craved the entertainment of watching their untouchable emperor be forced into uncomfortable admission. Severian felt their expectation like physical pressure, felt the trap closing with the inevitability of a mechanism designed by someone who understood exactly which levers to pull. He could end this easily. 3 sentences. Clear denial. Elara returned to general household staff. The rumors dismissed as fantasy. His authority reaffirmed. It was strategic necessity, political survival. The only rational choice for a man who'd built his reign on choosing power over sentiment every single time. He spoke without looking at her, his voice carrying the same measured certainty he used for declaring war or ratifying treaties. The rumors regarding household staff assigned to my private chambers are precisely that. Rumors built on misunderstanding and malicious interpretation. The woman in question serves in domestic capacity, nothing more. She has no claim to my person, no relationship beyond functional service, and those who suggest otherwise expose their own tendency toward fantasy rather than fact. This clarification is final. The matter is closed. The words fell like stones into still water, creating ripples that would become waves. He'd chosen each phrase carefully, clinically, designed to sever any perceived connection while maintaining his image of rational control. Elara felt something inside her crystallize and shatter simultaneously. She'd known this was coming, had known it the moment she understood what the court session was about. But knowing and experiencing existed in different countries of consciousness. She didn't move, didn't speak, didn't allow her face to register the violence his words had just committed. Because this was familiar territory, this public denial of her reality. Her father had done it. Her half-siblings had done it. Every room she'd entered in her 24 years had done it in smaller ways. But this was different because she'd allowed herself to believe. In the quiet hours when he trusted her presence, when his eyes held hers a moment too long, when the silence between them felt like conversation, that maybe she'd finally found someone who saw her as more than tolerable inconvenience. She'd been wrong, and the last fragment of hope she'd been foolish enough to nurture turned to ash so quietly no one noticed her dying except the man watching from the eastern gallery. Lord Althoran Vey had not built his reputation on impulsive action. At 38, he governed the Empire's coastal provinces with a combination of patience and perception that made him simultaneously valuable and dangerous to imperial stability. He'd watched Severian Kael consolidate power through ruthlessness disguised as necessity, had seen him crush rivals who moved too quickly or too obviously, had learned that survival near absolute power required understanding what the powerful refused to see about themselves. And what Severian couldn't see, what he'd just proven in the most spectacular fashion possible, was that denying attachment didn't eliminate it, only transformed it into weakness that would eventually metastasize into catastrophe. Althoran had noticed Elara months before the court began their malicious speculation. He'd visited the palace for a strategic alliance discussion and had observed her moving through Severian's study with the unconscious intimacy of someone who'd mapped every inch of another person's preferences. The way the Emperor's shoulders relaxed fractionally when she entered. The way his eyes followed her exit even as he continued conversation without pause. The way she anticipated his needs before he articulated them, creating a synchronization that spoke to hundreds of hours of silent observation. Althoran had been married once, briefly, to a woman who'd loved him genuinely before political necessity had destroyed that possibility. He recognized the architecture of unacknowledged love because he'd lived in its ruins. What had just occurred in the throne room wasn't political maneuvering. It was self-destruction dressed as strategy. Severian had chosen to protect his authority by severing the only genuine connection that made his authority bearable, and he'd done it publicly, irreversibly, with the confident brutality of a man who believed he could undo emotional damage through sheer force of will when convenient. Althoran knew better. He'd seen men win empires and lose themselves. He'd watched power corrupt not through obvious villainy, but through the gradual erosion of capacity to value anything that couldn't be controlled or conquered. And he'd just witnessed the exact moment when the great emperor had crossed from dominance into irretrievable isolation. The girl, Elara, he'd learned her name through careful inquiry, stood frozen in her designated space, maintaining the same careful invisibility she'd probably perfected over a lifetime of being unwanted. But Althoran saw what others missed. The microscopic tightening around her eyes, the particular stillness that came from holding shattered pieces of yourself together through pure will, the way her breathing had shifted to something shallower, more controlled, more desperate. She was drowning in public and no one was watching except him. And something in that moment, call it opportunity, call it genuine compassion, call it the recognition that sees itself in another's suffering, made a decision that would reshape the next several months of imperial politics. He didn't approach her immediately. That would have been too obvious, too calculated, too similar to the predatory opportunism the court would expect. Instead, he waited 3 days. Let her process the humiliation. Let the court's attention shift to new scandals. Let Severian settle back into the comfortable delusion that crisis had been successfully averted. And then, during a formal banquet, where she served among other household staff demoted through unspoken consensus back to complete invisibility, he did something radical. He acknowledged her, not with grand gesture or public declaration, simply by meeting her eyes when she refilled his wine, saying thank you with genuine warmth, and treating her like a human being whose existence deserved basic dignity. It was the smallest possible intervention. But in a world that had spent 24 years teaching her she was disposable, small acts of recognition carried revolutionary weight. Elara stopped entering Severian's private chambers. It wasn't dramatic rebellion or calculated punishment. She simply requested reassignment through proper channels, citing the need to respect boundaries the emperor had publicly clarified. The head of household staff, relieved to avoid potential scandal, approved immediately. A rotation of servants began maintaining his study, his correspondence, his morning routines. They were competent enough, efficient enough. They simply weren't her, and Severian noticed the difference with an irritation he refused to examine. His tea was slightly wrong temperature. His papers were organized logically, but not in the specific system he'd grown accustomed to. The room felt occupied by strangers even when he was alone. He told himself it was better this way. Cleaner. The council had been appeased, the rumors silenced, his authority reaffirmed without significant cost. Elara had been a convenience that had threatened to become a complication, and he'd resolved the matter with appropriate decisiveness. That she'd chosen to remove herself from his immediate vicinity was proof of her understanding of proper boundaries. He should feel satisfied. The problem had solved itself. Yet he found himself distracted during state meetings, losing thread of conversations because some part of his attention kept waiting for her quiet entrance, her understated presence, the particular quality of silence she brought that felt different from mere absence of sound. Elara, meanwhile, had retreated into the kind of invisibility that felt like erasure. She worked extended shifts in the palace kitchens, volunteered for laundry duty that kept her hands busy and her mind blank, avoided any corridor or chamber where she might encounter him. The other servants noticed her withdrawal but interpreted it as shame, the girl who'd gotten ideas above her station finally learning her place. No one asked if she was all right because people didn't ask that of servants, especially servants whose proximity to power had proven presumptuous. She didn't cry, didn't rage, didn't allow herself the luxury of visible grief. She simply contracted inward, making herself smaller and smaller, trying to become the nothing she'd always been told she was. The only person who seemed to notice her systematic disappearance was Lord Althoran, who had extended his stay at the palace under pretense of ongoing trade negotiations. He would encounter her in hallways that seemed accidentally chosen, would request her specifically when he needed household services, would engage in brief conversations that treated her like someone capable of thoughts worth hearing. He asked about her opinion on books she'd read, about her observations of palace life, about whether she'd ever seen the coastal provinces he governed. The conversations were brief, appropriate, never crossing into impropriety. But they carried an implicit message. You exist, you matter, you deserve to be seen. She didn't trust it at first. 38-year-old lords didn't engage household staff in genuine conversation without ulterior motive, but Althoran's attention felt qualitatively different from anything she'd experienced. He didn't look at her the way men sometimes looked at servants they considered available, didn't speak to her with the performative kindness that sought witness or reward. He simply talked to her like a person might talk to another person if social hierarchy weren't the defining architecture of all interaction. And slowly, carefully, she began to respond not just with polite monosyllables, but with actual thoughts, actual observations, actual pieces of herself she'd learned to keep hidden. It felt dangerous. It felt like hope. And she'd learned that hope was the most dangerous thing someone like her could allow herself to feel. Severian began experiencing what he would later recognize as withdrawal, though at the time he interpreted it as irritation at declining efficiency. His new attendants were perfectly adequate, trained, professional, invisible in the way servants should be, but they lacked whatever indefinable quality had made Elara's presence feel like extension of his own thought processes, rather than separate entity requiring management. He found himself snapping at them for minor infractions that wouldn't have registered before, dismissed 3 different servants in 2 weeks for failing to anticipate needs he hadn't articulated, and spent increasingly long hours in his study, accomplishing increasingly little. His advisors noticed his shortened temper. His military commanders reported decisions made with uncharacteristic hesitation. Something fundamental had shifted in the Empire's center of gravity. He saw her occasionally in passing, brief glimpses in corridors, her profile disappearing around distant corners, always moving away from rather than toward his vicinity. Each sighting produced a reaction he had no framework to process. Sharp awareness followed by something that felt uncomfortably like loss, though that was absurd because you couldn't lose what you'd never claimed. He told himself he was simply noting her continued presence in the palace, confirming that his public denial hadn't resulted in her dismissal or worse. Purely administrative observation, nothing more. But he noticed when she'd lost weight, when the shadows under her eyes deepened, when her careful invisibility transformed from practiced skill into something closer to disappearance. What disturbed him most were the dreams. Severian had trained himself to sleep lightly, to process information even in rest, to treat unconsciousness as unfortunate biological necessity rather than refuge. But now his sleep had become populated with images he couldn't control or dismiss. Elara standing in throne room as he spoke his denial. Except in the dream, her face wasn't carefully blank, but shattered. Elara walking away down endless corridors while he tried to call her back, but found he'd forgotten her name. Elara dissolving like morning fog, becoming transparent, becoming nothing, while he watched with growing panic he couldn't justify or explain. He would wake from these dreams with his heart racing, his certainty compromised, and the growing suspicion that he'd made a mistake whose dimensions he didn't yet understand. The realization came during a particularly tedious council meeting about tariff regulations on imported grain. Lord Chancellor Vorenus was droning about percentage adjustments. Other advisors were arguing minutiae, and Severian found his attention drifting to the corner of the chamber where Elara used to stand during his morning briefings. She'd never participated, never spoke, but her presence had somehow anchored him, given him a point of reference that made the performative theater of governance feel less exhausting. Without her, these meetings felt interminable in a new way, like he was performing authority for an audience that no longer included anyone who actually knew him. And that thought, that she'd known him, stopped him mid-sentence in a way that made his advisors exchange concerned glances. He dismissed the council early, citing urgent matters requiring immediate attention, and retreated to his chambers with the uncomfortable awareness that he was lying to himself about what he felt and why it mattered. For 45 years, he'd built his identity on control, over territory, over people, over his own inconvenient emotions. He'd genuinely believed that attachment was weakness, that isolation was strength, that a man who ruled millions could afford no vulnerability. But sitting alone in chambers that felt emptier than they'd ever been, he began to suspect that he'd confused control with capacity, that he'd mistaken the ability to deny feeling for the elimination of feeling itself. And the woman he'd publicly dismissed as nothing more than household staff had somehow become the only person whose absence made him question whether empire was worth the cost of absolute solitude. Althorin Vey had always understood that timing was everything in politics, and the moment had arrived with the clarity of inevitability. He'd spent weeks observing the aftermath of Severian's public denial, the Emperor's increasing irritability, Elara's systematic withdrawal, the palace's collective pretense that nothing significant had occurred. He'd watched Severian search for her in crowded rooms without seeming to realize he was searching, had seen the particular tension in the Emperor's shoulders when she appeared briefly, and then vanished. And he'd witnessed Elara's careful reconstruction of the armor she'd briefly allowed to crack, the way she was teaching herself to stop hoping for recognition that would never come. The window for intervention was closing. Soon she would retreat so completely that reaching her would require violence to the fragile equilibrium she was building. He approached her in the palace gardens during the brief hour between afternoon duties and evening service, when household staff were permitted to occupy the lesser courtyards normally reserved for minor nobility. She was sitting alone on a stone bench beneath an ancient olive tree, hands folded in her lap, staring at nothing with the particular stillness of someone trying to take up as little space as possible. When his shadow fell across her, she startled, quickly smoothing her expression into the careful blankness she'd perfected. He asked permission to sit, waited for her hesitant nod, and then did something radical for a man of his status. He sat in silence, demanding nothing, simply sharing the space without expectation or agenda. After several minutes, he spoke quietly, addressing his words to the garden rather than directly to her. He told her about his coastal provinces, the way morning light turned the ocean silver, the fishing villages where people still sang old songs his grandmother had taught him, the cliffs where you could stand and feel simultaneously infinite and insignificant. He described it not as a lord cataloging his holdings, but as someone sharing something beautiful with another person who might appreciate beauty. Elara listened without responding, but he felt the quality of her attention shift from wariness to something closer to curiosity. When he finally turned to look at her, he asked a simple question. When was the last time someone asked what you wanted, not what you could provide? The question broke something in her careful composure. Not dramatically. She didn't weep or confess or collapse into vulnerability. But her hands tightened fractionally in her lap, her breathing shifted, and when she finally spoke, her voice carried the raw honesty of someone who'd stopped having energy for performance. No one has ever asked me that. The words hung between them, simple and devastating. Althorin nodded slowly, recognizing the truth in her admission. He told her about his late wife, about loving someone while knowing that political necessity would eventually destroy that love, about the specific loneliness of being seen by someone who could never claim you publicly. He didn't compare their situations directly. That would have been manipulation. He simply offered recognition. I understand what it means to be denied by someone who should have chosen you. Before he left, he did something that would set palace rumor mills churning and force Severian's hand in ways neither man fully anticipated. He asked if she would consider visiting his coastal provinces as his guest. Not as servant, not as convenience, but as someone whose company he genuinely valued. He was careful to frame it as invitation rather than pressure, made clear she could refuse without consequence, emphasized that his interest was in knowing her rather than possessing her. But the offer itself was revolutionary. A lord of significant standing publicly expressing desire for a bastard girl's presence, treating her choice as something that mattered. Elara stared at him with naked confusion, as if he'd spoken a language she'd never learned. And in the palace window 3 stories above, behind curtains he didn't realize were open, Severian Kael watched the entire exchange with rising fury he had absolutely no right to feel. Severian had witnessed the garden conversation from his private study, drawn to the window by restlessness he couldn't name, and trapped there by a scene that detonated something volatile in his carefully controlled interior landscape. He watched Althorin sit beside Elara with easy familiarity, watched her posture gradually relax in ways it never had during their 3 years of proximity, watched the rival lord speak to her with the kind of attention Severian had never permitted himself to demonstrate. And when Althorin extended what was clearly an invitation, the specific body language of offering choice rather than issuing command, Severian felt rage bloom in his chest with such intensity, it actually surprised him. He had no claim to her, had publicly, explicitly denied any connection, had absolutely zero justification for the possessive fury currently threatening his legendary composure. He left the window before he could see her response, unable to bear witnessing whether she would accept or decline. The rational part of his mind, the part that had governed empires through logic and strategic calculation, insisted this was beneficial development. If Althorin wanted to assume responsibility for the girl, it solved a problem Severian had created by allowing her too much proximity in the first place. She would be provided for, removed from potential scandal, and Severian could return to the uncompromised isolation that had served him well for decades. Perfect solution. Except his hands were shaking, except he'd just dismissed his evening advisors with barely coherent excuse, except he was pacing his chambers like a caged predator, replaying the garden scene, imagining Elara and Althorin's coastal provinces, seeing her smile at someone else the way she'd never smiled at him. The jealousy was irrational and he knew it, which somehow made it worse. Jealousy required belief that you possessed something someone else threatened to take, and he'd never possessed Elara, had explicitly rejected the possibility of possession. Yet here he was, consumed by territorial rage over a woman he'd publicly identified as meaningless household staff. The contradiction should have been humiliating. Instead, it was clarifying in the most unwelcome way possible. Because if he was jealous, if the thought of her accepting Althorn's invitation made him want to do violence to a political ally, then perhaps the High Council had been right to force clarification. Perhaps there had been something between them that required acknowledgement. Perhaps his denial hadn't been strategic necessity, but catastrophic cowardice. He tried to approach it systematically, the way he approached military campaigns or economic policy. What exactly did he feel about Elara? Attachment, certainly. Her absence had proven that. Reliance, obviously. He functioned less effectively without her particular understanding of his needs. But was it more? Did he want her the way men wanted women? Or did he simply resent losing something that had made his burden easier to carry? He attempted to imagine claiming her now, after the public denial, after weeks of her systematic withdrawal. It would look desperate, would undermine the authority he'd protected by denying her in the first place, would confirm every suspicion his enemies had weaponized, would prove he could be controlled through emotional manipulation after all. But standing in chambers that felt cavernous without her quiet presence, Severian began to understand something that 45 years of conquering territory had failed to teach him. That some losses couldn't be measured in strategic terms, that some mistakes created consequences. Authority couldn't reverse, that he'd chosen empire over the only person who'd made empire feel bearable. And if she accepted Althorn's invitation, if she left for coastal provinces where some other man would learn to anticipate her silences, would earn her trust, would give her the recognition Severian had been too proud and too damaged to offer, then he would spend the rest of his reign winning battles while having already lost the only war that mattered. The realization didn't make him softer. It made him furious. But for the first time in decades, the fury was directed inward, at himself, at the profound stupidity of believing you could deny caring about something without consequences. Elara spent 3 sleepless nights considering Althorn's invitation, turning it over in her mind like an object she couldn't quite identify. Gift, trap, genuine offer, elaborate cruelty. Her entire life had trained her to distrust kindness from powerful men, to search for the transaction hidden beneath courtesy, to understand that nothing was ever freely given to women like her. Yet Althorn's attention felt qualitatively different from anything she'd experienced. He didn't look at her with the predatory calculation she'd learned to recognize, didn't frame his interest as favor she should feel grateful to receive. He simply treated her like someone whose thoughts and presence had intrinsic value, and that novelty was almost more terrifying than outright exploitation would have been. The coastal provinces he described sounded like fantasy, places where she might exist without the weight of imperial judgment, where her illegitimacy wouldn't define every interaction, where she could perhaps discover who she might become if not constantly performing invisibility. She imagined mornings watching ocean light, evenings without the hypervigilance that had governed her palace existence, conversations where she didn't have to calculate every word for potential offense. It sounded impossible. It sounded like the kind of hope that had always punished her for believing. But the alternative was remaining here, continuing to glimpse Severian in corridors, watching him not notice her absence, the way he'd never quite noticed her presence, slowly disappearing into the architecture, until even she forgot she'd once been real. What complicated her decision was the traitorous part of herself that still waited for Severian to respond to her withdrawal. Some pathetic fragment of hope insisted that if he cared at all, he would react, would seek her out, would acknowledge the silence between them had meant something, would prove that his public denial hadn't been complete truth. She hated that hope, hated how it made her linger in corridors he might traverse, how it made her heart accelerate at distant footsteps that might be his, how it kept her trapped in waiting for recognition from a man who'd made his position devastatingly clear. She needed to kill that hope before it killed her. And accepting Althorn's invitation might be the only mercy violent enough to accomplish the execution. She thought about what her life would look like in 5 years if she stayed. Still invisible, still waiting, still building meaning from serving someone who would never choose her. She'd become one of those palace servants who'd spent entire lifetimes in proximity to power while remaining fundamentally powerless. Women who aged into bitterness or resignation, who measured their existence in decades of unacknowledged service, who died having never been seen as anything beyond function. The image terrified her more than Althorin's invitation did. At least leaving carried the possibility of transformation. At least accepting his offer meant choosing herself in the way no one else ever had. At least she would know she'd tried to escape rather than spending the rest of her life wondering what might have happened if she'd been brave enough to want more. On the fourth morning after Althorin's invitation, she found him in the palace's diplomatic wing and gave her answer with the kind of quiet resolve that felt like both surrender and rebellion. Yes, she would accept his invitation. She would visit his coastal provinces. She would allow herself to be seen by someone who seemed genuinely interested in seeing her. The words felt like stepping off a cliff, exhilarating and terrifying and irreversible. Althorin received her decision with dignified warmth, promising to arrange appropriate travel, to ensure her comfort, to demonstrate that his interest was genuine rather than performative. As she left his presence, she felt something shift inside her. Not quite hope, not quite healing, but perhaps the first fragile possibility that her story didn't have to end in invisibility after all. Althorin Vey understood the necessity of public declaration in a way Severian had catastrophically failed to grasp. Private invitation was one thing, easily dismissed, easily denied, carrying no weight beyond personal exchange. But what he needed to do, both for Elara's protection and to force Severian's hand, required witnesses, formality, and the kind of social architecture that made retreat impossible for any party involved. So he requested formal audience with the emperor, full court attendance, specifically citing matters of diplomatic significance requiring public record. The High Council approved eagerly, always hungry for political theater. Severian accepted with cold efficiency, assuming this was routine alliance maintenance. Neither man acknowledged the trap being constructed from protocol and pride. The throne room filled with the same collection of nobles, advisors, and political opportunists who'd witnessed Severian's denial of Elara weeks earlier. The symmetry wasn't accidental. Althorin had specifically chosen this venue, this audience, this symbolic space where public words carried the weight of unchangeable decree. Severian sat on his obsidian throne radiating controlled authority, his expression revealing nothing, though those who knew him well noticed the particular tension in his shoulders that preceded decisions made through force rather than preference. Althorin approached with appropriate deference, but there was something in his bearing, a certainty, a clarity of purpose, that suggested this wasn't subordinate seeking favor, but equal-making declaration. He began with diplomatic formality, acknowledging the emperor's continued leadership, expressing gratitude for the stability Severian's rule provided the coastal provinces. Then, with the deliberate precision of someone who'd calculated every word's impact, he shifted tone. He spoke of having met someone during his extended palace visit, someone of remarkable intelligence, quiet strength, and profound dignity, despite circumstances that had failed to recognize her worth. He described Elara without naming her initially, building a portrait that made her sound extraordinary, valuable, worthy of protection and respect. The court began to murmur, recognizing the subject, anticipating scandal. Severian's hands tightened imperceptibly on the throne's armrests. Then Althorin did what Severian had been too proud, too damaged, too committed to isolation to do. He named her. Elara Myrne. He acknowledged her publicly, not as servant or convenience or household function, but as woman he genuinely valued and intended to honor. He announced his intention to bring her to his coastal provinces, not as staff, not as temporary guest, but as someone under his official protection, someone whose presence in his household would be recognized and respected. He didn't propose marriage, that would have been premature and strategic overreach, but he made clear that she mattered to him, that he claimed connection to her, that anyone who wished to insult or harm her would be insulting and harming him personally. The declaration detonated through the throne room like contained explosion. Nobles exchanged shocked whispers. The High Council looked uncertain whether to be scandalized or impressed. And Severian felt something inside him crack with such finality it was almost audible. Because Althorin had just done publicly what Severian had refused to do, had claimed Elara with dignity and clarity, where Severian had denied her with cowardice disguised as strategy. Worse, Althorin's declaration was positioned as protection rather than possession, as recognition rather than ownership. He'd given her what she'd always wanted: to be chosen, to be seen, to matter to someone willing to say so in front of witnesses. And Severian, trapped on his throne by the very authority he'd protected through denial, could do absolutely nothing to stop it without admitting everything he'd spent weeks refusing to acknowledge. Severian maintained perfect composure through the remainder of the court session, responded to Althorin's declaration with diplomatic neutrality that betrayed nothing, dismissed the assembly with his usual measured authority. But the moment his private chamber's doors closed behind him, something fundamental gave way. He'd spent 45 years building psychological architecture designed to withstand siege, walls against sentiment, fortifications against vulnerability, defenses that transformed emotion into strategy before it could threaten his control. And Althorin's public claiming of Elara had just revealed that all of it, every carefully constructed barrier, had been protecting emptiness rather than strength. He'd won empires, he'd crushed rebellions, he'd outlasted enemies and allies alike. And he'd just lost the only person who'd made any of it feel remotely worth the cost. The rage came first, volcanic, irrational, directed at Althorin for his audacity, at the High Council for their manipulation, at Elara for considering leaving, at himself for creating circumstances that made leaving her only rational choice. He wanted to summon his military commanders, to find some pretext for revoking Althorin's governorship, to exercise the absolute power he possessed and prevent this departure through sheer force of imperial will. But even in fury, some part of him recognized that approach would prove everything his enemies suspected: that he could be controlled through emotional attachment, that his judgment was compromised, that the great emperor was just another man made stupid by feelings he couldn't manage. The realization didn't calm his rage. It simply added layer of self-loathing beneath the anger. Beneath the rage was something worse, grief so profound it felt like physical injury, like something vital had been extracted without anesthesia. He'd never allowed himself to grieve before. Not when his wife died, not when his brother's betrayal required execution, not through any of the losses that accumulated over decades of choosing power above all else. He'd simply noted the absences and continued forward because that was what emperors did, what strength required, what survival demanded. But Elara's impending departure cracked something in that discipline. He found himself remembering small moments he hadn't known he'd cataloged, the way she'd read his moods in silence, the rare times she'd smiled at something he'd said, the specific quality of peace her presence had created in chambers that otherwise felt like battlefields. He tried to construct rational arguments for why her leaving mattered strategically rather than personally. She'd been efficient. Her replacement servants were objectively inferior. She'd understood palace dynamics. Her institutional knowledge would be difficult to replicate. She'd required minimal supervision, losing her created administrative inconvenience. But every rationalization collapsed under scrutiny because the truth was simpler and more devastating. He'd relied on her not for what she did, but for who she was when she did it. For the way she'd looked at him sometimes like he was human rather than monument. For the silent understanding that had made isolation feel fractionally less absolute. For the possibility, never acted upon, never acknowledged, but always present, that someone could know him and not find the knowledge unbearable. The worst part was understanding that he'd done this to himself. Althorin hadn't stolen Elara. He'd simply recognized value Severian had been too damaged to claim. The High Council hadn't destroyed what existed between them. Severian had done that himself by choosing political expedience over honest acknowledgement. She wasn't leaving because she wanted to hurt him. She was leaving because staying meant accepting permanent invisibility from the one person whose recognition she'd actually wanted. Every element of this catastrophe traced back to his own choices, his own cowardice, his own fundamental inability to value connection more than control. And sitting alone in chambers that felt like mausoleum rather than palace, Severian Kael confronted the possibility that he'd spent 45 years winning everything that didn't matter while losing the only thing that did. Elara spent her final 3 days in the palace, moving through rooms that had become simultaneously familiar and alien, saying goodbye to a life she'd never quite inhabited but had somehow built meaning within anyway. Other servants treated her departure with mixture of envy and suspicion, some genuinely happy she'd found opportunity beyond palace walls, others convinced she'd manipulated her way into Lord Althorn's favor through methods they whispered about in corners. She didn't bother correcting their assumptions. Let them believe what made sense to them. She was too exhausted from years of managing others' perceptions to care what story they constructed about her exit. She packed the few possessions that were actually hers. Mostly books Severian had discarded and she'd quietly kept. Clothing adequate for travel, letters from her father she'd never answered. The hardest part was the possibility of final encounter with Severian. She both dreaded and desperately hoped for it, some pathetic part of her still waiting for him to stop her, to acknowledge what had existed between them, to prove that his denial hadn't been complete truth. She found herself taking routes through the palace that maximized chance of crossing his path, lingering in corridors near his chambers, timing her movements to coincide with his usual routines. It was masochistic and she knew it, this final grasping at recognition from someone who'd made his position devastatingly clear. But hope, even hopeless hope, died hard. And some fragment of her needed to know whether he'd let her leave without acknowledgement, whether 3 years of silent intimacy would end with the same invisibility that had defined her entire existence. Severian, meanwhile, was conducting his own tortured surveillance. He'd learned her departure schedule through channels he told himself were purely administrative, confirming household staff transitions, ensuring proper documentation for her travel. But truthfully, he was tracking her final movements through the palace with the obsessive attention he'd once reserved for military campaigns. He knew which corridors she favored, which hours she'd be in which wings, when she'd make final visits to gardens or library. He constructed elaborate justifications for why he might accidentally encounter her. State business requiring his presence in specific locations, routine inspections suddenly necessary, but never quite manufactured courage to execute the plans. Because what would he say? What words existed that could bridge the chasm his denial had created? The night before her scheduled departure, Elara made final visit to Severian's private study. Not his chambers, she couldn't bear that intimacy, but the room where she'd spent hundreds of hours organizing his correspondence, maintaining his library, existing in his peripheral vision. She told herself she was simply ensuring her replacement understood the filing system, but truthfully she needed to say goodbye to the space that had felt closest to belonging she'd ever experienced. She ran her fingers along book spines she'd dusted countless times, stood in the exact spot where she'd learned to read his silences, breathed air that still carried faint scent of the particular ink he preferred, and she allowed herself, finally, to weep. Quiet, contained tears for the life she'd imagined here, for the recognition she'd wanted, for the man who'd taught her it was possible to be necessary without mattering. She didn't know that Severian stood outside the study door for 17 minutes, hand raised to knock, words rehearsed and abandoned and rehearsed again. She didn't know that he'd come there specifically because he'd known she'd make this final visit, that he'd intended to stop her or claim her or at minimum acknowledge that her leaving carved hole in his existence he had no idea how to fill. She didn't know that he stood paralyzed by pride and fear and the certain knowledge that anything he said now would sound like exactly what it was. Desperation from a man who'd waited until loss was inevitable to recognize value. When she finally emerged from the study, eyes red but composed, she walked past his hiding place without seeing him. And he let her go. Not because he wanted to, not because it was strategic, but because 45 years of choosing power over vulnerability had calcified into something he no longer knew how to break, even when breaking it was the only thing that might save him from absolute solitude. Dawn broke cold and gray over the palace the morning Elara was scheduled to leave, the kind of colorless light that made everything look half-finished, provisional, like the world itself hadn't decided whether to fully commit to the day. She woke in the servants' quarters she'd occupied for 3 years, dressed in travel clothes Althorn had provided, simple but fine quality, the kind of garments that marked her as under noble protection, rather than household staff. The other servants were still sleeping, which suited her perfectly. She'd said her goodbyes the night before, accepted their well wishes with the performance of gratitude, and now wanted only to leave quietly, without ceremony or attention. She carried her single bag down empty corridors, her footsteps echoing against marble that had witnessed 3 centuries of arrivals and departures, and would witness countless more after she became forgotten footnote in palace history. Althorn's carriage waited in the eastern courtyard, ornate but not ostentatious, horses stamping impatiently in morning chill. He stood beside it dressed for travel, and when he saw her approaching, his expression warmed with something that looked genuinely pleased rather than proprietarily satisfied. He took her bag without making production of the gesture, handed her into the carriage with courtesy that assumed her comfort mattered, and for a moment she felt the strangeness of being treated like someone whose preferences deserved consideration. The interior was lined with soft cushions, blankets against the cold, even books for the journey. Small considerations that spoke to someone having thought about her experience, rather than simply arranging her transport. It should have felt wonderful. Instead, it felt like mourning, because every kindness from Althorin highlighted everything Severian had failed to offer. Severian watched the departure from his study window, positioned where he could observe without being observed, maintaining the cowardice that had defined his handling of this entire catastrophe. He'd been standing there since before dawn, unable to sleep, unable to not witness this final severance. He watched Althorin help Elara into the carriage with careful attention, watched her settle into the interior without looking back at the palace, watched the driver prepare for departure with efficient routine, and he felt something inside him fracture with such completeness it was almost relief, like a bone that had been improperly set, finally breaking cleanly, creating possibility of healing even as it caused excruciating pain. He'd lost her. Completely. Irreversibly. And unlike every other loss in his 45 years, this one couldn't be rationalized or strategized or conquered through force of will. The carriage began to move, wheels grinding against cobblestone, horses finding rhythm, the whole apparatus of departure achieving momentum that made intervention increasingly impossible with each passing second. Severian's hand pressed against the window glass hard enough that his fingers went white, his breath creating fog that obscured his view, his entire body rigid with the war between pride and desperation. He could stop this, could send guards, could invoke imperial authority, could prevent her departure through sheer exercise of power. But what then? Force her to stay against her will? Prove he was exactly the tyrant his enemies claimed? Demonstrate that his attachment was possession rather than care? Even in extremity, some part of him recognized that stopping her now would destroy whatever fragile possibility remained of her ever looking at him with anything other than justified resentment. The carriage reached the palace gates, paused for the guards' routine inspection, then passed through into the city beyond. Elara didn't look back. Not once. Not even the reflexive glance of someone leaving familiar territory for unknown destination. She simply faced forward, toward coastal provinces, and a man who'd chosen to recognize her, toward a future that didn't include the emperor who'd taught her that being necessary wasn't the same as being chosen. And Severian, still standing at his window long after the carriage disappeared from view, understood with crystalline clarity what he'd spent weeks avoiding, that he'd loved her. Not in the careful, managed way he'd loved his late wife. That had been alliance, affection born of convenience, comfortable arrangement that had required nothing deeper than mutual tolerance. He'd loved Elara the way drowning men loved air, the way desert travelers loved water, the way people dying of cold loved fire. Desperately. Completely. With the kind of need that made you question who you'd be without the thing you needed. And he'd realized it exactly one departure too late. The weeks following Elara's departure revealed the architecture of Severian's dependence in ways that would have humiliated him if he'd had energy left for pride. His efficiency collapsed. Correspondence piled up unanswered. Council meetings dragged interminably because he couldn't maintain focus through political theater that suddenly felt pointless. His military commanders reported decisions delayed or made with uncharacteristic hesitation. The empire continued functioning. Empires had momentum that survived individual dysfunction, but the center had gone hollow. His advisors attributed the change to fatigue, to the burden of decades of absolute rule, to anything except the obvious truth, that the great emperor was unraveling because a bastard girl had left and taken something essential with her. He stopped sleeping properly, stopped eating with any regularity, moved through his days like automaton executing familiar patterns while something vital remained elsewhere. Reports arrived from the coastal provinces with regular efficiency. Althorin sent formal updates about trade routes and regional stability, perfectly appropriate diplomatic communication. But Severian read them searching for information never included, whether Elara had arrived safely, whether she seemed content, whether Althorin treated her with the respect he'd promised. He interrogated the gaps between words like military intelligence, constructing narratives from absence, torturing himself with imagination of her laughter in someone else's presence, her comfort in someone else's care, her gradual forgetting of the 3 years she'd spent making an emperor's loneliness bearable. Jealousy had calcified into something more corrosive, not possessive rage, but profound grief for the relationship he'd refused to acknowledge while it existed. The transformation, when it finally came, wasn't dramatic revelation or sudden enlightenment. It was erosion. Week by week, the certainties he'd built his identity upon crumbled under scrutiny he could no longer avoid. That attachment was weakness? He'd been stronger with Elara's quiet presence than he was now in isolated authority. That emotion compromised judgment? His judgment had never been worse than when he'd chosen political expedience over honest feeling. That a man who ruled millions couldn't afford vulnerability? What good was ruling millions if it required becoming something incapable of connection, something monument-like and fundamentally alone? Every principle he'd used to justify his denial revealed itself as fear disguised as philosophy, cowardice wrapped in strategic language. He began tentatively to examine what life might look like if he'd chosen differently. If he'd claimed Elara before the High Council forced his hand. If he'd prioritized her dignity over his political convenience. If he'd been brave enough to say publicly what he'd felt privately, that she mattered, that her presence had value beyond function, that 3 years of silent intimacy had created bond more essential than any alliance or conquest. The alternate timeline tortured him because it was so obviously better than his current reality. Yes, the council would have been scandalized. Yes, his enemies would have sensed opportunity. Yes, it would have required defending a choice that made him vulnerable. But vulnerability shared with someone who understood you? Wasn't that better than invulnerable isolation? Wasn't being known and choosing to be known anyway worth more than being feared by people who would never actually see you? 6 weeks after Elara's departure, Severian made a decision that would have been unthinkable months earlier. He wrote a letter, not to Althorin, not formal imperial communication, but personal message addressed to Elara herself. He didn't ask her to return, didn't make demands or invoke authority or construct strategic arguments. He simply told the truth he should have spoken before witnesses in throne room, that she had mattered, that her absence had revealed dependence he'd refused to acknowledge, that denying her had been the gravest mistake of a life defined by calculated choices and ruthless pragmatism. He admitted he had no right to her forgiveness, no claim on her future, no expectation of response. But he needed her to know that someone had seen her, truly seen her, not as servant or convenience, but as person whose existence had made his bearable. He sealed the letter with hands that trembled slightly, sent it through private courier, and understood that her response or lack thereof would determine nothing about his transformation. He'd already lost her. But perhaps he didn't have to lose himself to the isolation he'd mistaken for strength. Perhaps consciousness, even painful consciousness, was better than the comfortable numbness that had governed 45 years of empire. Perhaps the great emperor, stripped of the woman who'd made his power feel purposeful, might finally learn what it meant to be simply human, broken, aware, and irreversibly changed by what he'd failed to choose, when choosing still mattered.